The Sackler family, one of the world's wealthiest and most enigmatic dynasties, built a colossal empire in the pharmaceutical industry. But behind it lies a web of dark secrets that have shocked public opinion. Founded by three brothers, Arthur, 1913 to 1987, Mortimer, 1916 to 2010, and Raymond Sackler, 1920 to 2017. Sons of Jewish immigrants from Galicia, the family transformed Purdue-Frederick into Purdue Pharma, the notorious drug company behind OxyContin. Their fortune reached $13 billion in 2015, primarily from opioid sales, philanthropic endeavors, and Mundipharma, their global network of companies. Yet beneath the veneer of philanthropy, the Sackler family concealed offshore assets, information cover-ups, and even internal schemes reminiscent of the Arnault family's corporate espionage or Lorraine's assassination plots. Unlike the rapid decline of the Gould family's wealth, the Sacklers' influence endures through complex trusts, similar to the Grosvenors' longevity. These secrets have emerged not only through lawsuits, but also internal documents, prompting many museums to erase the Sackler name from their donor lists. Join us in delving deeper into the journey from the pinnacle of power to the abyss of scandal for the Sackler family. A cautionary tale about the power of money and the consequences of greed. From new money to old money, the Sackler family emerged from humble beginnings in the gritty streets of Brooklyn, where they were the sons of Jewish immigrants who had fled hardship in Galicia and struggled to make ends meet during the harsh years of the Great Depression. These three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, harbored ambitions in medicine that would eventually propel them to create a massive pharmaceutical enterprise, one that promised to revolutionize the way pain was managed in everyday life, but instead contributed to one of the most devastating public health crises of the modern era. Their wealth originated as what is often termed new money, the kind earned through bold entrepreneurial risks in uncharted territories, similar to the pioneering efforts of the Brickell family in the untamed wilderness of early Miami. William and Mary Brickell, a couple who relocated from Ohio in the late 19th century, arrived in Florida around 1871 and began acquiring vast tracts of land along the Miami River, establishing trading posts that catered to local Seminole Indians and other settlers in a region plagued by mosquitoes, swamps, and isolation. Through sheer determination, they developed real estate holdings that formed the foundation for what later became known as Millionaire's Row, a strip of luxurious estates that symbolized the transformation of raw opportunity into lasting prosperity. This spirit of innovation and grit in the face of adversity closely paralleled the Sacklers' own early experiences in a tight-knit Brooklyn immigrant neighborhood during the 1930s. Growing up in modest circumstances, the brothers attended the historic Erasmus Hall High School, a public institution known for educating generations of New Yorkers, before pursuing medical degrees that equipped them with the knowledge to challenge outdated practices. They went on to work at the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center, a state-run facility in Queens, where they pioneered progressive treatments that moved away from invasive procedures like lobotomies, favoring instead pharmaceutical interventions that emphasize medication and humane care. Additionally, they advocated for integrated blood banks during a time of racial segregation in healthcare, demonstrating an early commitment to ethical advancements that would later contrast sharply with the controversies surrounding their business decisions. The Sacklers, however, did not remain confined to the characteristics of new money for an extended period. They carefully engineered a transition toward the more established and enduring category of old money, characterized by refined social status, intergenerational stability, and influence within elite circles. This evolution was achieved through a deliberate combination of sharp business strategies, calculated social connections, and protective financial mechanisms that lifted them from their immigrant origins into the upper strata of society. The process rested on four fundamental pillars that converted their initial hard-earned gains into a complex legacy, marked by both achievement and profound controversy. The first pillar was their expansive pharmaceutical empire, which served as the solid foundation of their wealth and power. In 1952, the brothers acquired a small company called Purdue-Frederick, originally focused on mundane products like laxatives and antiseptics, and rebranded it as Purdue Pharma, headquartered in Stamford, Connecticut. This transformation reached its peak with the introduction of OxyContin in 1996, a controlled-release formulation of oxycodone designed to provide long-lasting relief for patients suffering from chronic pain conditions, such as arthritis or cancer. The drug's innovative coating allowed for gradual absorption, theoretically reducing the risk of peaks and valleys in pain management that could lead to misuse. Yet its success was staggering, amassing over $35 billion in sales since its launch, a figure that placed it on par with the vast media conglomerate assembled by William Randolph Hearst. Hearst began his empire modestly in 1887 by taking over the San Francisco Examiner from his father, a senator who had won it in a poker game, and expanded it aggressively through acquisitions and sensational reporting techniques known as yellow journalism. By the 1930s, Hearst controlled nearly 30 newspapers across major cities, influential magazines including Cosmopolitan and Harper's Bazaar, and even a film production company that produced newsreels and features. His media outlets shaped public opinion, famously inflating stories to drum up support for the Spanish-American War in 1898. Much like how Purdue's marketing reshaped medical practices. Purdue deployed a large sales force that visited physicians' offices far more frequently than competitors, sometimes up to 10 times as often, emphasizing data that highlighted OxyContin's purported safety and minimal addiction potential, which encouraged widespread prescribing for non-cancer pains like backaches or injuries. This approach turned Purdue into a privately owned behemoth, fully controlled by the Sackler family, with annual revenues peaking at billions, while maintaining opacity through its non-public status. This pharmaceutical dominance was not developed in a vacuum. It was reinforced by the second pillar, extensive cultural patronage that enhanced their public image with an air of intellectual and artistic refinement. The family donated tens of millions of dollars to renowned institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where the Sackler Wing, opened in 1978, became a dedicated space for ancient Egyptian artifacts, featuring grand galleries that attract millions of visitors annually to view mummies, temples, and sculptures from antiquity. Similarly, they funded the Sackler Wing for Oriental Antiquities at the Louvre in Paris, a section devoted to Asian and Middle Eastern art that includes priceless ceramics and bronzes, and supported Yale University with endowments for art galleries, scientific research centers focused on neuroscience, and scholarships for students in the humanities. These contributions paralleled the philanthropic vision of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor and heiress who, after the Metropolitan Museum rejected her collection of modern American art in the 1920s, established the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1930. Starting with a modest gallery on 8th Street in Greenwich Village, Whitney used her Vanderbilt inheritance, derived from railroads and shipping, to champion living artists like Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe, eventually relocating the museum to iconic buildings, including its current home in the meatpacking district designed by Renzo Piano. The Sacklers' gifts fostered an equivalent perception of them as guardians of culture, with their name etched on structures like Harvard's Arthur M. Sackler Museum, which houses Asian Islamic and later Indian art, in a modernist building completed in 1985, Oxford's Sackler Library, a hub for classical studies, opened in 2001, and even spaces at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. However, as the opioid crisis unfolded, these donations came under scrutiny, with critics arguing they served as a form of reputation management to distract from the family's role in promoting addictive medications, leading to a wave of institutions reconsidering their associations. The third pillar involved strategic marriages that integrated the Sacklers into networks of prestige and influence, further cementing their rise. Arthur Sackler, the oldest brother, and the driving force behind much of the family's early success, exemplified this through his personal life, which featured a series of unions driven by ambition and connectivity. His first marriage in 1934 was to Else Finnick Jorgensen, a Danish woman he met during his medical studies, but it ended in divorce after several years. He then wed Marietta Lutz in 1949, a union that also dissolved amid his demanding career. Finally, in 1980, he married Gillian Leslie Tully, a British art dealer and socialite, a partnership that endured until his passing in 1987 and connected him to international cultural circles. These relationships bore resemblance to the calculated matrimonial alliances of Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping tycoon who rose from humble origins in Smyrna to dominate the global tanker industry. Onassis's first major marriage in 1946 was to Athena Tina Livanos, the daughter of his rival Stavros Livanos, which not only merged competing fleets, but also elevated his status in aristocratic shipping families. Later, his 1968 marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of President John F. Kennedy, blended immense wealth with unparalleled celebrity, allowing him to navigate high society while expanding his empire to include airlines and real estate. In a similar vein, Arthur's marriages facilitated the Sacklers' entry into elite spheres, while other family members followed suit. Mortimer, known for his cosmopolitan lifestyle, renounced his U.S. citizenship to strengthen British connections through his third wife, Teresa Rowling, a socialite who helped establish ties in European nobility and earned him a knighthood. Meanwhile, Raymond maintained a stable long-term marriage to Beverly Feldman from 1944 until his death in 2017, providing a grounded family base amid the brothers' expansive pursuits. The fourth and final pillar was wealth protection, a sophisticated system designed to preserve their fortunes for future generations amid potential threats. The Sacklers channeled significant portions of their assets into offshore trusts based in Bermuda, establishing robust barriers that preserved family oversight while reducing exposure to taxes, legal claims, and economic volatility. These structures were comparable to the innovative dynasty trusts initiated by the Rockefeller family in the 1930s under John D. Rockefeller Jr., who, inheriting the remnants of Standard Oil's monopoly after its 1911 breakup, created the 1934 Trust to distribute wealth across multiple generations, potentially up to 150 years, through mechanisms like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which focused on philanthropy in areas such as conservation and international affairs. By avoiding heavy estate taxes and preventing wasteful spending, The Rockefellers ensured their legacy endured, much like how the Sacklers utilized Bermuda entities alongside holdings in the Channel Islands to layer their finances intricately. For instance, documented transfers included $261 million moved in 2010 through these channels, allowing the family to protect their empire as public and legal pressures intensified, maintaining control over distributions and minimizing vulnerabilities in an increasingly litigious environment. Despite these fortifications, the opioid scandals and resulting lawsuits overshadowed their achievements, eroding the legitimacy they had built in a manner reminiscent of Edward Dohany's entanglement in the Teapot Dome scandal. Dohany, an Irish-American oil prospector who struck fortune in California's oil fields during the 1890s, becoming one of the richest men in America with ventures like the Pan American Petroleum Company, became infamous for bribing Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall in 1921 to secure leases on federal naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California. This led to explosive 1924 Senate investigation, high-profile trials where Doheny was ultimately acquitted in 1929 after testifying that the $100,000 loan to Fall was innocent, though Fall was convicted of bribery, marking the scandal as a symbol of corruption in President Warren G. Harding's administration, and tarnishing Doheny's reputation permanently despite his earlier philanthropy in education and the arts. In parallel, the Sacklers confronted allegations that Purdue Pharma's marketing tactics deliberately understated OxyContin's addictive properties, positioning it as suitable for routine ailments like dental pain or sports injuries, which accelerated an epidemic responsible for over 850,000 opioid overdose deaths in the United States since 1999. Internal communications exposed harsh attitudes, such as emails from Richard Sackler, Raymond's son and former Purdue president, referring to those struggling with addiction as scum of the earth or criminals, while the company continued to profit. The legal backlash was immense, with more than 3,000 lawsuits filed by states, municipalities, Native American tribes, and individuals, peaking in Purdue's 2019 bankruptcy filing after a 2007 corporate guilty plea to misbranding charges that resulted in a $600 million fine. Notably, no Sackler family members faced personal criminal charges, even though they held dominant positions on the board and approved key strategies. In the midst of this upheaval, the breadth of the Sackler fortune became evident through a diverse array of assets that combined corporate strength, luxurious properties, cultural endowments, and financial instruments. Central to this were their business operations. Purdue Pharma, the Connecticut-based entity that developed and marketed OxyContin, generating peak annual sales of $3 billion in the early 2010s, and Mundipharma, an international web of companies operating in over 120 countries, collectively valued between $3 billion and $5 billion. Mundipharma continued to sell pain medications, including versions of OxyContin, in markets outside the U.S., yielding substantial profits, such as $531 million from just 9 affiliates between 2020 and 2022, with regional sales reaching $439 million in Europe's 5 largest economies, $88 million in Australia, and $302 million in China. Its decentralized setup, lacking a unified parent company, enabled profits to flow through low-tax jurisdictions, maintaining secrecy and efficiency even as domestic revenues declined due to regulatory crackdowns. Complementing these were real estate holdings that embodied elegance and heritage, the Stargroves Manor in Hampshire, England, a Georgian-style estate with expansive gardens, lakes, and historical ties to the 18th century. Previously owned by music icons like Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, who used it as a recording retreat in the 1970s, and various Manhattan properties, such as elegant townhouses and high-end apartments on the Upper East Side, areas synonymous with New York's old money aristocracy, offering privacy and proximity to cultural hubs while echoing the family's origins in the city. Their cultural assets extended this prestige. The Sackler Wing at the Metropolitan Museum, a 1978 expansion that not only displayed Egyptian relics but also hosted educational programs and exhibitions drawing global audiences, paired with Arthur Sackler's vast personal art collections, comprising thousands of Asian antiquities like Chinese jades, Japanese prints, and Indian sculptures, many of which he donated to the Smithsonian Institution's Arthur M. Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C., opened in 1987 as part of the National Museum of Asian Art. This patronage initially appeared indelible, but backlash intensified, resulting in institutions like the Tate Modern in London, the Guggenheim, and the National Portrait Gallery stripping the Sackler name in 2019 following activist campaigns. The Louvre followed suit that year, and the Met did so in 2021. However, some, like Harvard University, decided in 2024 to retain the name on its Arthur M. Sackler Museum in another building after a committee review, citing Arthur's death before OxyContin's launch and the family's separation of branches. Finally, investments provided diversification. The Bermuda Offshore Trust, which concealed and protected billions from legal reach through multi-layered entities, and Beacon Co., a discreet firm involved in their broader financial strategies, allowing for holdings in equities, bonds, and other ventures beyond pharmaceuticals. Arthur Sackler's secret Valium marketing tactics. Have you ever wondered how a single pill could become a cultural icon, whispered about in songs like the Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper, prescribed to millions as a quick fix for everything from anxiety to everyday stress, and yet hide a web of aggressive tactics that set the stage for one of the biggest health crises in modern history? Picture the swinging 1960s, a time of revolution, rock and roll, and rapid change, when a drug called Valium exploded onto the scene, marketed as a safe miracle cure for the tensions of modern life. But behind that glossy promise was a man named Arthur Sackler, a brilliant psychiatrist turned marketing mastermind who pioneered strategies so bold and boundary-pushing that they not only made Valium the best-selling drug of its era, but also laid the groundwork for the opioid epidemic through OxyContin decades later. Today we're diving deep into Arthur Sackler's secret Valium marketing tactics, uncovering how he paid doctors to endorse it, how this was all hushed up to protect his image as a generous philanthropist, and why it echoes historical scandals like the persecutions under Lorraine's Elizabeth Charlotte, or ethical breaches in Whitney's Navy kickbacks and Hohenzollern's Wilhelm II deals. We'll analyze Roche's Valium campaigns and Arthur's agency records for those payment details, framing it all as the Valium scheme Arthur buried. And remember, this isn't speculation. The marketing is factual, the payments are documented, and even ex-posts align with it, though they often lack the gritty specifics. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand the secrets, you have to know the man. Arthur Sackler was born in 1913 in Brooklyn, New York, the eldest of three brothers in a family of Jewish immigrants from Galicia. He wasn't just smart, he was a polymath, a doctor, an art collector, a businessman, who saw medicine not just as a healing art, but as a marketplace ripe for innovation. By the 1950s, Arthur had already made waves in psychiatry, working at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center where he and his brothers pushed for more humane treatments, ditching lobotomies in favor of medications. But his real genius shone in advertising. He founded the William Douglas McAdams Agency, one of the first to specialize in medical ads, and he revolutionized how drugs were sold. Before Arthur, pharmaceutical marketing was tame, mostly dry journal ads aimed at doctors. Arthur changed that. He believed in direct, persuasive campaigns that targeted physicians with data, testimonials, and incentives, turning them into unwitting salespeople for the drugs. Enter Valium, or diazepam, as it's scientifically known. Developed by Leo Sternbach at Hoffmann La Roche in the late 1950s, it was a benzodiazepine, a class of tranquilizers meant to calm nerves without the heavy sedation of barbiturates. Roche launched it in 1963, but it was Arthur Sackler's aggressive marketing that turned it into a blockbuster. He handled the advertising campaign through his agency, and boy, did he pull out all the stops. Picture this. In the 1960s, America was buzzing with social upheaval, Vietnam protests, civil rights marches, women's liberation stirring. People were stressed, and Arthur positioned Valium as the answer. His ads flooded medical journals like JAMA and Psychosomatics, depicting scenarios where Valium could help with psychic tension, a vague term that covered everything from marital woes to job pressure. One famous ad showed a young woman carrying a suitcase, looking frazzled, with the tagline implying Valium could ease the burdens of daily life. Another portrayed housewives, overwhelmed by household duties, subtly suggesting it was mother's little helper for the suburban blues. These campaigns weren't just selling a pill, they were selling relief, normalcy, and productivity in a chaotic world. But here's where it gets shadowy. Arthur didn't stop at ads. He pioneered paying doctors to endorse Valium, a tactic that blurred the lines between medicine and commerce. Through his agency, he recruited prominent physicians to write glowing articles or give talks praising the drug's safety and efficacy. These weren't always straightforward payments. Sometimes it was speaking fees, research grants, or lavish dinners. Records from Arthur's agency and Roche's campaigns show how he orchestrated detail men, sales reps who visited doctors' offices armed with samples, brochures, and data twisted to highlight benefits while downplaying risks like dependency. One documented strategy involved sending direct mailings to thousands of doctors, including free samples and endorsements from key opinion leaders who'd been compensated. In fact, internal memos and later investigations revealed that some testimonials came from fictitious or paid sources, creating an illusion of widespread medical consensus. By 1965, a physician in psychosomatics was already questioning, when do we not use Valium? Because the marketing had expanded its uses so broadly, from anxiety to muscle spasms, even alcohol withdrawal. This aggressive push paid off massively. Valium sales skyrocketed. From its launch in 1963, it became the top-selling drug in the U.S. by 1968, holding that spot until 1982. At its peak in 1978, over 2.3 billion pills were sold, generating hundreds of millions for Roche, and a cut for Arthur through his agency's deals. But this success set a dangerous precedent. Arthur's tactics, co-opting doctors, influencing the FDA with selective data, and downplaying addictiveness, became the blueprint for Purdue Pharma, the company his brothers Mortimer and Raymond ran after buying it in 1952. When they launched OxyContin in 1996, they used the same playbook: aggressive detailing, paid endorsements, and expanding indications beyond severe pain. Richard Sackler, Raymond's son, even echoed Arthur's style in internal emails, pushing for wider prescribing. The result? OxyContin fueled the opioid crisis, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, all tracing back to that Valium model. Now, why was all this hushed? Arthur Sackler wasn't just a marketer. He crafted himself as a philanthropist extraordinaire. He donated millions to museums, universities, and cultural institutions, amassing one of the world's largest collections of Asian art. His name graced wings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harvard, and the Smithsonian. This image of a benevolent patron masked the cutthroat side of his business. The payments to doctors, the manipulative ads. These were kept quiet, buried in agency records and corporate files to preserve his legacy as a giver, not a profiteer. It's like how Elizabeth Charlotte, the Duchess of Lorraine, in the early 18th century, hid her role in religious persecutions behind a facade of royal piety. Born in 1676 as a Protestant princess, she converted to Catholicism for her marriage to Leopold, Duke of Lorraine, and became fiercely intolerant. She persuaded her husband to issue edicts persecuting non-Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and others, forcing conversions, expulsions, and property seizures. These oppressive laws, issued between 1699 and 1718, devastated communities in Lorraine, yet Elizabeth Charlotte presented herself as a devout, cultured figure, writing letters that criticized court excesses while ignoring her own bigotry. Her persecutions were hushed in official narratives, much like Arthur's tactics were downplayed to maintain his philanthropist aura. Both used power to push agendas that harmed many, all while curating a polished public image. To develop this story further, let's analyze Roche's Valium campaigns in detail. Roche, the Swiss pharma giant, partnered with Arthur's McAdams agency for a multifaceted blitz. Ads in medical journals were colorful and narrative-driven, a departure from bland text. One series from the mid-1960s showed patients before and after Valium, tense and unproductive versus calm and functional. They claimed low addiction risk, less than 1% based on cherry-picked studies, ignoring long-term data. Direct mailings to doctors included educational booklets, ghostwritten by paid experts, emphasizing Valium's versatility. Sales reps, trained by Arthur's methods, visited offices up to 10 times more than competitors, offering free samples and incentives like golf outings or conference sponsorships. Agency records, unearthed in later lawsuits and books like Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, detail payments. Doctors received honoraria for consulting or speaking at Roche events, sometimes thousands per engagement. One scandal involved fictitious physician testimonials, ads featuring made-up doctors praising Valium, a breach that drew scrutiny but was quickly buried. Compare this to Whitney's Navy kickbacks for ethical breaches. The Whitney family, American industrialists tied to the Vanderbilts, had ties to scandals involving improper payments. In the early 20th century, Harry Payne Whitney, a financier and Navy enthusiast, was linked to influence peddling during World War I, where contracts for naval supplies involved kickbacks to secure deals. Though not directly prosecuted, it mirrored broader corruption like the Teapot Dome scandal, where oil barons bribed officials for leases. More recently, echoes in the Fat Leonard scandal of the 2010s, where Malaysian contractor Leonard Francis bribed U.S. Navy officers with cash, prostitutes, and luxuries for overbilling contracts worth millions. Over 30 officers were convicted, showing how payments erode integrity, just as Arthur's doctor endorsements compromise medical objectivity. Similarly, Hohenzollern's Wilhelm II deals highlight royal ethical lapses. Wilhelm II, the last German Kaiser from the Hohenzollern dynasty, ruled from 1888 to 1918 and was infamous for scandals that tainted his reign. His court was rife with corruption, The Eulenburg Affair of 1907 to 1909 exposed a homosexual clique among his advisors, leading to blackmail and perjury trials that damaged the monarchy's reputation. Wilhelm himself was accused of unethical arms deals, pushing German firms like Krupp to sell weapons abroad, inflating conflicts for profit. Post-World War I, the Treaty of Versailles arraigned him for a supreme offense against international morality, though he fled to exile in the Netherlands. His aggressive diplomacy and hidden dealings, like secret pacts with Austria-Hungary, paralleled Arthur's buried tactics. Both maintained facades of grandeur while engaging in breaches that harmed society. Framing this as the Valium scheme Arthur buried captures the essence, a calculated plan interred under layers of philanthropy and denial. Arthur died in 1987 before OxyContin, but his scheme lived on. Critical note, the marketing is factual, backed by FDA records and congressional hearings in the 1970s that probed Valium's overprescription. Payments are documented in agency ledgers and whistleblower accounts. Ex posts align. Users discuss Sackler's Valium role, linking it to opioids, but they lack specifics like exact payment amounts or ad budgets, often just venting about the family's greed. Purdue's secret clinical trial manipulations. What if I told you that a single pill, hailed as a breakthrough for chronic pain sufferers, was built on a foundation of twisted science, hidden truths, and corporate greed that would spiral into a national nightmare, killing hundreds of thousands? Back in the 1990s, when Purdue Pharma was gearing up to launch OxyContin, they didn't just test the drug, they allegedly rigged the game, cherry-picking data to make it look far safer than it really was, downplaying the massive addiction risks that would later devastate communities across America. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's backed by internal documents unearthed in explosive 2020 lawsuits, revealing how Purdue altered trial protocols in ways that echo the sneaky trust manipulations in Sumner Redstone's scandals. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Purdue's secret clinical trial manipulations, examining the FDA submissions and internal records that expose the evidence, comparing it to DuPont's infamous PFOA cover-up, and even the deceptive practices surrounding Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos' so-called conversion. We'll frame this whole saga as the trials the Sacklers rigged. And keep in mind, this manipulation is verified, the concealment is fully documented, but ex posts out there often lack the nitty-gritty trial specifics. Buckle up, because this story isn't just about a drug, it's about how far a company would go to chase billions and the human cost that followed. Let's rewind to the early 1990s, a time when America was starting to rethink pain management. Doctors were being told that undertreating pain was almost cruel, and pharmaceutical companies were racing to fill that gap with new, supposedly safer opioids. Enter Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family, who saw an opportunity in reformulating oxycodone, a powerful narcotic already on the market but known for its short duration and high abuse potential. They created OxyContin, an extended-release version that promised steady pain relief over 12 hours, reducing the need for frequent dosing and, they claimed, lowering the risk of addiction. But to get this greenlit by the FDA in 1995, Purdue had to run clinical trials, and that's where the shadows start creeping in. According to internal documents later revealed in lawsuits, Purdue didn't conduct straightforward science. They manipulated the process, selectively highlighting favorable data while burying anything that screamed warning signs about addiction. Picture the scene. Purdue's researchers designing trials in the mid-1990s, testing OxyContin on patients with various pain conditions, from post-surgical recovery to chronic issues like arthritis. These studies were supposed to prove the drug's efficacy and safety, but internal memos show a different story. For instance, Purdue cherry-picked results to emphasize that the controlled-release formula delayed absorption, which they spun as making it less likely to be abused than immediate-release opioids. This claim made it into the drug's labeling, a single sentence that became a marketing goldmine. Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin tablets, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. But was this belief grounded in solid evidence? Not really. Internal documents from Purdue, unsealed in cases like the 2019 Massachusetts lawsuit and others around 2020, admit that they lacked robust clinical studies to back up such sweeping safety claims. In fact, some trials showed that a significant number of patients, up to 40% in certain studies, didn't get the full 12-hour relief, leading to breakthrough pain and higher dosing, which actually increased addiction risks. Yet Purdue altered protocols mid-trial, adjusting endpoints or excluding data from non-responders to make the outcomes look better. These manipulations weren't accidental, they were strategic. Take the example of how Purdue handled addiction data. In their submissions to the FDA, they reported addiction rates as low as under 1%, based on hand-picked studies that focused on short-term use in controlled settings, ignoring long-term realities where patients built tolerance and craved more. Internal emails and board minutes exposed in 2020 federal settlements, where Purdue pleaded guilty to felony charges, reveal executives discussing how to minimize risk perceptions. One document even noted that early trial signals of dependency were downplayed because they could hurt approval chances. It's like they were editing a movie script, cutting out the scary scenes to sell a feel-good story. And the Sacklers, they were deeply involved. Family members like Richard Sackler, who oversaw much of the launch, approved these strategies in board meetings, pushing for aggressive interpretations of the data to fuel what became a $35 billion revenue stream. Now, to really dig into this, let's examine the FDA trial submissions and Purdue's internal records, as those hold the smoking guns. The FDA approved OxyContin in December 1995 after reviewing Purdue's new drug application, which included data from about a dozen clinical trials involving around 1,000 patients. But a closer look, thanks to documents from the Justice Department's 2020 Global Resolution, where Purdue admitted to misleading regulators, shows how submissions were skewed. For example, Purdue cited a study on cancer patients where addiction seemed low, but extrapolated that to non-cancer chronic pain without adequate testing. They also modified trial designs post hoc, like changing how they measured pain relief from strict 12-hour benchmarks to more flexible averages, making the drug appear more effective. Internal records, including a 1995 memo, acknowledge that the abuse potential is not zero, yet this was buried in favor of promotional language. By 2001, when reports of abuse surged, Purdue's own audits showed they knew the 12-hour claim wasn't holding up. Patients were dosing more frequently, heightening risks, but they didn't update the labeling until forced years later. These revelations exploded in 2020 amid Purdue's bankruptcy and multi-billion-dollar settlements. Lawsuits from states like New York and Minnesota unsealed troves of emails where Purdue scientists admitted in private that trials didn't demonstrate that a Purdue product will be safer or more effective for extended use, yet publicly claimed otherwise. One chilling internal note from the 1990s compared OxyContin's risks to other opioids, but selectively omitted data showing higher euphoria peaks when crushed, a key abuse method. This cherry-picking directly fueled the crisis. Doctors, relying on FDA-approved labels, prescribed it widely, leading to over 500,000 overdose deaths linked to prescription opioids since 1999. This kind of deception draws stark parallels to Sumner Redstone's trust manipulations, where hidden agendas twisted legal and personal affairs for control. Sumner Redstone, the media titan behind Viacom and CBS, faced scandals in his later years involving his trusts and estate. In 2016, at age 93 and in declining health, Redstone was accused by ex-girlfriends, Manuela Herzer and Sydney Holland, of being manipulated into giving them over $150 million in gifts during a 5-year spree from 2010 to 2015. They claimed he was competent, but lawsuits revealed allegations of elder abuse, with Herzer suing after being evicted, arguing Redstone's daughter Sherry was pulling strings to oust them and seize power. Court filings showed Redstone's trusts were altered amid questions of his mental capacity. He could barely communicate, yet changes favored Sherry, leading to battles where Philippe Dauman, Viacom's CEO, sued over his removal from the trust, calling it undue influence. A 2016 Massachusetts trial probed whether Redstone was manipulated, with testimony about his slurred speech and dependency on aids. Though settled privately, the saga exposed how trusts were rigged behind closed doors, much like Purdue's trial protocols were tweaked in secret to protect profits and family control, concealing vulnerabilities that could unravel everything. Shifting gears, Purdue's tactics also mirrored DuPont's PFOA cover-up, a decades-long deception where a company hid chemical dangers to safeguard its empire. DuPont, the chemical giant, started using perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, or C8, in the 1950s for Teflon production at its Washington Works plant in West Virginia. Internal memos as early as 1961 showed DuPont knew PFOA was toxic. Lab tests on animals revealed liver damage and birth defects, but they buried it. By the 1970s, a Haskell laboratory study funded by DuPont found PFOA highly toxic when inhaled and moderately toxic when ingested, yet they didn't alert workers or regulators. Instead, they monitored employee blood levels secretly, discovering elevated PFOA in pregnant workers' fetuses by 1981, leading to birth defects like eye malformations, but reassigned women without disclosure. DuPont dumped PFOA waste into the Ohio River, contaminating water for 80,000 people, causing cancers and diseases. Lawsuits in the 2000s, including a $671 million settlement in 2017, unsealed documents showing DuPont manipulated studies, cherry-picking data to downplay risks, delaying EPA reports, and funding biased research claiming safety. Even after phasing out PFOA by 2015 under pressure, spin-off chemours continued discharges. This concealment harmed communities for generations, just as Purdue's trial tweaks downplayed OxyContin's addiction, prioritizing billions over public health. On a historical note, these deceptive practices echo the maneuvers of Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos and his controversial conversion in the 15th century. John VIII, ruling from 1425 to 1448, amid the Ottoman Empire's siege on Constantinople, desperately sought Western aid. In 1438, he traveled to the Council of Florence, agreeing to a union between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, essentially converting or submitting Orthodox doctrine to papal authority in exchange for military support. But this was widely seen as deceptive. John didn't genuinely believe in the Union, but used it as a political ploy, signing the decree in 1439 while knowing his clergy and people back home rejected it as betrayal. Upon return, riots erupted. The Union was renounced and no real aid came, hastening Constantinople's fall in 1453. John's tactics, altering religious protocols for survival, downplaying the schism's risk to secure alliances, mirrored Purdue's data tweaks for FDA approval, both hiding true consequences to maintain power, only for the facade to crumble under scrutiny. Framing this entire ordeal as the trials the Sacklers rigged nails it perfectly. It's not just about flawed science. It's a rigged system where the Sacklers, through Purdue, orchestrated trials like a fixed boxing match, ensuring their drug won on points, while the real knockout came to unsuspecting patients. Internal board notes show Richard Sackler dismissing early addiction reports as not too bad, pushing forward despite red flags. By 2007, Purdue pleaded guilty to misbranding, paying $600 million, but no family charges stuck. The 2020 resolutions ramped it up. Purdue admitted to a 3-count felony, agreeing to dissolve and pay $8.3 billion, though the Supreme Court in 2024 blocked Sackler immunity, leading to a reworked $6 billion deal in 2025. Yet, Mundipharma abroad still profits from similar drugs. Critically, this manipulation is verified through FDA records, congressional hearings like the 2020 House Oversight Committee, where Sacklers testified, and archives like the opioid industry documents at UCSF. Concealment is documented in sealed then unsealed files from over 3,000 lawsuits. But on X, posts about Purdue OxyContin trial manipulation are sparse and superficial. Searches turn up general outrage like Sacklers rigged the system or threads on Empire of Pain, but no deep dives into specific trial IDs, altered endpoints, or cherry-picked stats like the under 1% addiction claim. Users vent about the crisis, but skip the granular evidence, often linking to news clips without protocol details. Purdue's secret deceptive marketing of OxyContin. Purdue Pharma's deceptive marketing of OxyContin stands as one of the most egregious examples of corporate misconduct in modern history, where a company under Richard Sackler's guidance knowingly promoted a highly addictive painkiller as safe and low risk, contributing directly to an opioid epidemic that has ravaged the United States for decades. By as early as 1999, Purdue executives, including Sackler, had clear evidence of widespread abuse, diversion, and overdoses linked to the drug, yet they continued to flood the market with misleading claims that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids, suppressing internal red flags and derogatory emails about victims to sustain billions in profits. This calculated strategy not only amplified the crisis, but also drew parallels to other high-profile deceptions, such as Bernard Arnault's LVMH concealing labor exploitation and espionage, Sumner Redstone's Viacom family engaging in surveillance scandals, and the Trastamara dynasty's veiled operations during the Spanish Inquisition. In this exploration, we'll delve into Purdue's internal memos and FDA communications to reveal the intricate details of their tactics, label it squarely as the lie that fueled the opioid crisis, and acknowledge that although the deception is thoroughly verified through legal records, many ex-posts pushing wider conspiracy narratives tend to lack concrete backing. At the core of this scandal lies Purdue Pharma's aggressive promotion of OxyContin under Richard Sackler, who held the presidency from 1999 to 2003 and continued influencing decisions as a prominent board member long after. Sackler, A physician by training and part of the family that owned the company oversaw a marketing overhaul that positioned OxyContin as a revolutionary extended-release oxycodone formulation offering consistent 12-hour pain relief for chronic conditions. Introduced in 1996, the drug's time-release coating was touted as a feature that minimized the intense euphoric rush associated with immediate-release opioids, supposedly making it harder to abuse and less likely to cause addiction. However, this narrative crumbled under scrutiny, as internal company documents later disclosed that Purdue began receiving alarming reports of misuse by 1997, escalating sharply by 1999. Pharmacists reported suspicious prescriptions from pill mills, clinics dispensing opioids indiscriminately, while emergency rooms noted surges in overdoses from patients crushing the pills to bypass the slow-release mechanism for an instant high. Communities, particularly in rural areas like Appalachia, saw thefts from pharmacies skyrocket, with black market sales turning OxyContin into hillbilly heroin. Despite these signals, Sackler and Purdue persisted, directing a sales force to assure doctors that addiction rates were below 1%, a figure derived from limited short-term trials on cancer patients that failed to capture the drug's long-term dangers in broader populations. They broadened the drug's indications far beyond end-stage cancer pain, encouraging prescriptions for common ailments such as lower back pain, fibromyalgia, or post-injury discomfort, deploying reps who visited physicians' offices up to 10 times more frequently than rivals. These reps distributed free starter coupons, funded educational seminars, and compensated influential doctors through speakers' bureaus, where key opinion leaders received payments ranging from $1,000 to $5,000 per talk to echo Purdue's safety claims, effectively turning medical professionals into unwitting promoters. The efforts to conceal the truth were systematic and unyielding. Among the most damning evidence were internal emails, including Richard Sackler's 2001 message in response to escalating abuse reports, where he coldly labeled affected individuals as reckless criminals, shifting blame onto users rather than examining the product's inherent risks. In that specific email chain, Sackler reacted to media coverage of overdoses by insisting they are reckless criminals, dismissing the human suffering as self-inflicted, while Purdue's revenues climbed to $35 billion cumulatively from OxyContin sales alone. Other communications uncovered executives referring to those battling addiction as scum of the earth or culprits who are failing us miserably, even as confidential analyses confirmed that aggressive marketing was exacerbating misuse patterns. These documents were deliberately shielded from public view, regulators, and initial FDA reviews, enabling Purdue to uphold the illusion of a benign medication. This pattern of secrecy closely resembled Bernard Arnault's management of labor scandals at LVMH, the world's largest luxury conglomerate, where exploitative practices were hidden to preserve a facade of elegance and exclusivity. In June 2024, Italian authorities placed LVMH's Dior subsidiary under judicial administration after raids exposed 4 Chinese-owned subcontractors near Milan employing 32 workers, including undocumented immigrants, in dire conditions. 15-hour shifts without breaks, sleeping quarters in the workshops, and wages as low as 2 to 3 euros per hour, far below legal minimums, to assemble handbags retailing for 2,600 euros each. Arnault, with a net worth exceeding $200 billion as France's wealthiest individual, and LVMH's CEO publicly denied awareness, but probes revealed entrenched supply chain issues, compounded by a separate espionage scandal involving Bernard Squarcini, the ex-head of France's domestic intelligence, convicted in March 2025 of misusing public resources to aid LVMH. Hired by Arnault in 2013 to lead LVMH security, Squarcini, nicknamed the Shark, leveraged his former agency contacts for illicit surveillance, bugging meetings, hacking emails, and compiling dossiers on critics like journalists and filmmakers, exposing labor abuses, all while receiving a €200,000 annual salary plus bonuses. Sentenced to 4 years in prison, 2 suspended, and fined €200,000, Squarcini's actions helped LVMH quash threats discreetly, much like Purdue's suppression of damaging emails preserved their opioid empire, valuing financial gains over ethical accountability. To deepen our understanding, consider the wealth of Purdue's internal memos and FDA exchanges that illustrate the marketing's manipulative depth. Memos from the late 1990s, revealed in the 2019 Massachusetts lawsuit, detailed initiatives like Project Tango, a program to partner with electronic health record companies to prompt doctors toward opioid prescriptions, and targeted outreach to high-volume prescribers flagged in the Region Zero database for questionable practices. Doctors Purdue knew were overprescribing but continued supplying to inflate sales figures. One such memo candidly stated that the abuse potential is not zero, yet promotional brochures and videos asserted the opposite, highlighting purported abuse deterrent features without comprehensive proof. FDA correspondence further exposes Purdue's sway. Their 1995 new drug application secured a groundbreaking label implying reduced abuse liability, despite relying on trials lacking extensive long-term addiction data. As abuse escalated in 2001, the FDA issued warnings about deceptive advertisements portraying OxyContin for moderate pain without addiction caveats, but Purdue delayed compliance, only introducing a tamper-resistant reformulation in 2010, internally documented as still marketed misleadingly, failing to demonstrate a drop in overall dependency rates. The 2003 Government Accountability Office report spotlighted the campaign's scale, with the sales team growing from 300 to over 671 representatives by 2001, conducting 150,000 annual doctor calls to reinforce the low addiction myth. Culminating in the 2020 Justice Department agreement, Purdue confessed to deceiving the FDA on safety metrics, agreeing to $8.3 billion in penalties and felony guilty pleas. Accessible via repositories like the University of California, San Francisco's Opioid Industry Documents Archive. These records highlight a deliberate pattern: downplaying adverse trial outcomes, fabricating educational materials for unaccredited pain management courses, and forecasting sales growth at the expense of public health. This corporate duplicity finds echoes in Sumner Redstone's Viacom scandals, where espionage and manipulation were tools to safeguard family control amid internal power struggles. Redstone, the late media baron who built a $40 billion empire encompassing Viacom and CBS, became entangled in lawsuits alleging his daughter Sherry orchestrated surveillance on his ex-companions to consolidate influence over his trusts. In 2016, after expelling girlfriends Manuela Herzer and Sydney Holland, who had collectively received over $150 million in gifts during their relationships with the then 93-year-old Redstone, Herzer filed suit claiming Sherry paid a nurse $10,000 to deploy spyware on Holland's computer, monitoring emails and calls to gather compromising information. Invoking RICO statutes typically used against organized crime, Hertzer accused the Redstones of a conspiracy to evict rivals and amend trusts in Sherry's favor, especially as Sumner's health deteriorated. He struggled with speech and mobility, raising competency questions during trust revisions. Courts permitted the espionage allegations to advance, denying Sherry's motions to dismiss damages claims, underscoring the covert operations that paralleled Purdue's email suppression to protect business interests. Redstone's World War II intelligence background added irony, but the contemporary intrigue involved bribing caregivers for recordings and hiring private investigators to probe personal lives, all veiled to uphold the mogul's authority, mirroring Sackler's hidden contempt for addicts to sustain OxyContin's untarnished reputation. Historically, Purdue's tactics resonate with the Trastamara dynasty's opaque management of the Spanish Inquisition, a mechanism of control cloaked in religious fervor. Ascending in the 14th century through turbulent civil wars in Castile and Aragon, the Trastamaras, culminating in Ferdinand II and Isabella I, fortified their rule by instituting the Inquisition in 1478 to purge heresy among conversos, Jews coerced into Christianity. The system thrived on secrecy. Anonymous accusations invited neighbors to betray one another. Torture methods like the strappado or waterboarding extracted false confessions. Defendants were denied lawyers or witness identities, and proceedings occurred in sealed chambers with public autos, defaced serving as theatrical displays of piety to obscure the brutality. Leveraging the Inquisition post-Noble rebellions, the monarchs targeted suspected crypto-Jews, confiscating assets to fund wars and explorations, culminating in the 1492 Alhambra Decree, expelling 200,000 Jews and executing or exiling thousands more. Records were meticulously concealed, procedures undocumented to prevent challenges, projecting an image of unified Catholic devotion while pursuing political dominance, akin to Purdue's suppressed memos, minimizing risks to perpetuate the opioid push, inflicting enduring societal harm under a guise of benevolence. Terming this the lie that fueled the opioid crisis, aptly summarizes how Purdue's falsehoods propelled the drug's dominance, with prescriptions surging from 670,000 in 1997 to 6.2 million by 2002, fostering abuse, shifts to cheaper heroin, and the fentanyl influx that amplified lethality. The core deception that OxyContin posed minimal addiction threat was ingrained in advertisements, patient brochures, promotional videos, and branded merchandise, like fishing hats or CDs, persisting beyond the 2007 $600 million misbranding settlement, where Purdue admitted to false promotion but avoided family prosecutions. External firms like McKinsey & Company bolstered it, consulting on turbocharging sales by identifying prolific prescribers and countering regulatory pushback. The devastation is quantifiable: over 800,000 U.S. deaths from opioids since 1999. Though provisional 2024 data shows a 27% drop to 54,743 opioid-involved fatalities, amid interventions like naloxone distribution, with rural regions still suffering tripled overdose rates and economic fallout. Critically, the marketing's fraudulence is substantiated by unsealed court files, FDA audits, and pacts like the 2020 felony admissions, with hiding evidenced in redacted emails and manipulated datasets. Yet, discussions inflating conspiracies, such as tying Sacklers to Murdoch's media for addiction propagation or unsubstantiated cartel connections, frequently miss proof, emphasizing fury over facts. as in threads equating opioids to political manipulation without referencing memos or FDA correspondence. Users often rant about the family's culpability but overlook granular elements like specific trial manipulations or email quotes, simplifying intricate fraud into broad plots. Purdue's secret bribes to doctors. Have you ever stopped to think about how a powerful company could turn everyday doctors into unwitting accomplices in one of the deadliest health crises America has ever seen, all through a web of lavish gifts, exotic trips, and disguised payoffs that looked legitimate on paper? That's the dark underbelly of Purdue Pharma's secret bribes to doctors, a scheme that turbocharged prescriptions for OxyContin and poured fuel on the opioid addiction fire, especially in vulnerable spots like Virginia where overdose rates exploded. These bribes weren't crude cash handoffs in back alleys. They were cleverly hidden behind so-called speaker programs, where Purdue paid physicians thousands to give talks at fancy dinners or conferences, essentially buying their loyalty to push more pills and ignoring the skyrocketing addiction that followed, much like how DuPont's PFOA scandal involved burying evidence of toxic chemicals leaching into communities while raking in profits from Teflon. Today, we're pulling apart this hidden operation, investigating Purdue's speaker program records and Department of Justice filings to uncover the gritty bribe details, comparing it to the corrupt bribes in Thomas Lee's Ohio Company land grabs or Bernard Arnault's LVMH empire exploiting workers in sweatshops, and framing the whole mess as the bribes that spread OxyContin. And just to be clear, these bribes are fully verified through court documents and investigations, with the concealment tactics well documented, but those ex-posts floating around often miss the specific facts, jumping straight to vague rants without the hard evidence. Let's get right into the heart of what Purdue was doing, because this wasn't some minor side hustle. It was a core part of their strategy to flood the market with OxyContin, a potent opioid that promised long-lasting pain relief, but hooked millions instead. Starting in the late 1990s, as OxyContin hit the shelves, Purdue zeroed in on doctors, especially in high-risk areas like rural Virginia, where chronic pain from coal mining injuries or factory work made people prime targets for prescriptions. They targeted regions with high unemployment and limited healthcare access, knowing these spots had fewer safeguards against overprescribing. The bribes came in the form of extravagant perks, all expenses paid trips to luxury resorts in Florida or California, where educational seminars doubled as vacations complete with golf outings and spa treatments, high-end gifts like expensive watches, fine dining vouchers, or even cash equivalents through consulting fees, and direct payments disguised as honoraria for speaking engagements that often involved little more than showing up to a dinner with a handful of colleagues. These speaker programs were the perfect cover. Purdue claimed they were legitimate ways to educate peers about pain management, but in reality they were pay-to-play setups where doctors got up to $2,000 or more per event, sometimes hosting multiple gigs a month, directly correlating with spikes in their OxyContin scripts. Internal records show Purdue tracked these speakers closely, prioritizing those who prescribed the most, and even had quotas for how many high-dose prescriptions they expected in return. This wasn't accidental. It was a machine designed to spread addiction, turning trusting physicians into sales extensions, while Purdue pocketed billions, and the human toll mounted with families. In places like Appalachia, losing loved ones to overdoses that traced back to those very pills. The concealment was slick, making it hard for outsiders to spot at first. Purdue funneled the money through third-party event planners or medical education companies, logging them as professional services in their books to avoid red flags from regulators. They required non-disclosure agreements from participants and buried the true purpose in layers of paperwork, claiming the programs complied with industry guidelines like the Pyramid Code, which supposedly limited such perks but had loopholes big enough to drive a truck through. But behind closed doors, emails and memos revealed the truth. Sales reps were instructed to select speakers based on their prescribing volume, not expertise, and to drop them if scripts dipped. One whistleblower account described how reps would wine and dine doctors at steakhouses, slipping in mentions of vacations as rewards for loyalty. This fueled the addiction crisis massively. Doctors in Virginia, for instance, became some of the highest prescribers per capita, leading to overdose hotspots where entire towns were decimated, with emergency calls for naloxone reversals becoming routine. It's eerily similar to DuPont's PFOA scandal, where the chemical giant knew as far back as the 1950s that perfluorooctanoic acid, a key ingredient in Teflon, was toxic, causing birth defects and cancers in lab animals, yet they dumped thousands of tons into landfills and rivers near their West Virginia plant, contaminating drinking water for tens of thousands. DuPont hid internal studies showing PFOA in workers' blood at alarming levels, downplayed risks in public statements, and fought lawsuits for years, eventually settling over 3,500 cases for $671 million in 2017 after evidence showed they had covered up the dangers since 1961, prioritizing non-stick pan profits over community health. Just like Purdue ignored addiction signals to keep the OxyContin cash flowing. To really unpack this, let's investigate the specifics from Purdue's speaker program records and DOJ filings, because the devil is in those details that show how deliberate it all was. Purdue's speaker programs ramped up post-1996 launch with budgets ballooning to millions annually. By 2000, they were spending over $40 million on marketing, a chunk going to these events. DOJ investigations, including the 2020 global settlement where Purdue pleaded guilty to kickback schemes, revealed ledgers listing payments to over 2,000 doctors, some earning $100,000 or more a year for talks that lasted minutes or happened in empty rooms. Filings from the 2007 misbranding case, where Purdue paid $600 million, included admissions that reps promoted off-label uses during these gigs, but the bribery aspect came into sharper focus in later probes. For example, in Virginia, where Purdue focused heavily due to high painkiller demand from manual labor jobs, records show they sponsored trips to pain conferences in Las Vegas or Hawaii, covering flights, hotels, and meals worth thousands per doctor, correlating with a 300% rise in prescriptions in some counties. Whistleblowers testified that reps were trained to say things like, "Join our speaker bureau and share your expertise while enjoying a weekend getaway," but internal metrics tied bonuses to prescription upticks post-event. The DOJ's 2020 charges highlighted how these weren't educational. They were quid pro quo, with Purdue ignoring FDA warnings about improper promotion. This mirrors the unethical practices in Thomas Lee's Ohio company Bribes back in the 18th century, where Lee, a Virginia planter and politician, founded the Ohio Company in 1748 to speculate on 500,000 acres of land west of the Appalachians. To secure the grant from the British Crown, Lee and his associates, including George Washington's half-brothers, allegedly bribed colonial officials and Native American leaders with gifts, rum, and promises of trade monopolies, navigating the corrupt landscape of the Board of Trade in London by influencing key figures like the Duke of Bedford with under-the-table deals. When rivals like the Loyal Company complained, Lee's group used political connections to squash opposition. Much like Purdue leveraged industry lobbying to fend off scrutiny, both exploiting systems for territorial gains, Lee for land empire, Purdue for market dominance, while displacing and harming locals, whether indigenous tribes or addicted patients. And speaking of exploitation, Purdue's scheme stacks up against Bernard Arnault's LVMH scandals, where the luxury behemoth has faced repeated accusations of worker abuse in its supply chain to keep costs low and profits high. Arnault, the billionaire CEO whose family controls LVMH, saw his Dior unit placed under court administration in Italy in 2024 after police raids uncovered Chinese-owned subcontractors forcing migrant workers into 15-hour days without breaks, sleeping on factory floors, and earning pennies to stitch handbags sold for thousands. Investigations showed systemic neglect, with LVMH denying knowledge but evidence pointing to ignored audits, and a parallel spy scandal where ex-intelligence chief Bernard Squarcini was convicted in 2025 for using state resources to surveil critics of these practices. Just this year, Loro Piana, another LVMH brand, faced similar court oversight for exploiting workers in Peruvian vicuña wool harvesting, underpaying indigenous communities, and falsifying sustainability claims. Arnault's empire, like Purdue's, hid these horrors behind a polished image, prioritizing billions in revenue over human dignity, echoing how Purdue's bribes spread OxyContin while downplaying the devastation. Framing this as the bribes that spread OxyContin hits the nail on the head because these payoffs weren't isolated. They were the engine driving the drug's explosion, turning a niche painkiller into a blockbuster that hooked generations. Purdue selected speakers from high-risk areas like Virginia's coal country, where economic despair made opioids a quick fix, and the bribes ensured loyalty even as addiction reports piled up. Doctors, enticed by the perks, wrote scripts for higher doses and longer durations, feeding the cycle of dependency that led to street diversion and overdoses. Critical to note, these bribes are verified through DOJ settlements, whistleblower testimonies, and unsealed records showing millions funneled illicitly. The concealment is documented in how Purdue classified them as legit expenses, dodging anti-kickback laws until cracked down on. Sackler's secret offshore wealth transfers. What if a family that built an empire on pills, peddled as pain miracles, actually siphoned off billions in secret, stashing it in shadowy offshore havens while their drugs wrecked lives across America, leaving courts and victims chasing ghosts in the wind? That's the bombshell reality of the Sackler family's secret offshore wealth transfers, a decade-long heist from 2008 to 2018 where they pulled a staggering $10.7 billion out of Purdue Pharma, the company behind OxyContin, and funneled it into impenetrable trusts in Bermuda and the Channel Islands, all meticulously concealed to bulletproof their fortune against the tidal wave of opioid lawsuits crashing down. This wasn't some panicked scramble. It was a cold, calculated shield, mirroring Andrew Mellon's infamous tax evasion ploys, where he dodged millions through clever art donations and trusts in the 1930s, or the British Windsor family's habit of sealing royal wills for generations to bury scandals, and even Joseph Bonaparte's sneaky smuggling of Napoleonic treasures across the Atlantic after his brother's empire crumbled. Today we're cracking open this vault, analyzing leaks from the Paradise Papers and New York Attorney General filings to expose the gritty transfer details, comparing it to those historic hides like the Windsor's locked away legacies or Joseph's diamond-stuffed escapes, and framing the whole saga as The billions the Sacklers hid offshore. And keep in mind, these transfers are stone-cold factual, backed by court docs and investigations, with the secrecy layers fully documented. But those ex-posts buzzing about it often skim the surface without nailing down the specifics like exact amounts or destinations. Let's dive straight into the core of this secret, because the Sacklers didn't just dip their toes into offshore waters. They plunged in deep, pulling out $10.7 billion from Purdue between 2008 and 2018, a period when the opioid crisis was exploding and lawsuits were starting to bite. Purdue, the Stanford-based pharma giant they owned lock, stock, and barrel, had raked in over $35 billion from OxyContin since its 1996 launch. But as addiction deaths climbed past 200,000 by 2010 in states like Kentucky, sued for deceptive marketing, the family got savvy about protecting their cut. They withdrew the money in chunks, sometimes hundreds of millions at a time, routing it through a maze of holding companies before landing it in trusts scattered across Bermuda, a sunny tax haven with ironclad privacy laws, and the Channel Islands like Jersey and Guernsey, where secrecy is king and regulators rarely peek. For instance, one branch funneled cash through Beacon Company and Rose Bay Medical, shell entities that split funds equally among family members, while another wired $64 million through Swiss bank accounts tied to Mortimer D.A. Sackler, as uncovered in leaks showing his family's use of private banking for wealth protection. This concealment wasn't accidental. It was engineered to shield assets from opioid victims seeking justice, with trusts structured so creditors couldn't touch them, even as Purdue faced over 3,000 lawsuits by 2019 claiming the company fueled the epidemic that killed 500,000 Americans. The family insisted these were legitimate dividends, but filings paint a picture of urgency, transfers spiking after the 2007 $600 million misbranding plea, with $1 billion traced by New York's Attorney General in 2019, including wires as recent as 2018 when bankruptcy loomed. It's like they saw the storm coming and battened down the hatches, leaving Purdue a hollow shell while their billions sailed safely offshore. To really unpack this, let's analyze the Paradise Papers and New York AG filings, because those hold the smoking guns on how the transfers went down. The Paradise Papers, a 2017 leak of 13.4 million files from offshore firm Appleby and trust companies like Asia City, exposed the Sacklers' web of entities in Bermuda and beyond, showing how Mortimer Sackler, knighted in Britain and a key Purdue board member, used Swiss banks like HSBC Private Bank to stash funds, with accounts opened as early as 2003 holding millions in assets tied to family trusts. One file detailed a Guernsey-based company wiring $64 million to Purdue's international arm, looping back to Sackler pockets, while Bermuda, trusts like those under Beacon Co., acted as firewalls, with layers of nominees and blind structures to obscure ownership. The New York AG's 2019 suit against Purdue and 8 Sacklers drilled deeper, tracking $1 billion in wires through Swiss accounts and U.S. banks, including $20 million involving Mortimer D.A. Sackler alone, some funneled via a Purdue parent company to personal holdings. AG Letitia. James called it a web of illegal financial transactions, with transfers hitting peaks like $261 million in 2010, timed as lawsuits mounted after revelations of deceptive marketing downplaying OxyContin's addictiveness. These docs, unsealed in bankruptcy court, show the family directing the outflows, board minutes approving dividends that bypassed U.S. taxes via offshore routing, shielding from estate duties and judgments. By 2018, as Purdue teetered, The last wires zipped out, leaving the company bankrupt in 2019 with $8.3 billion in settlements. But the Sacklers' offshore stash, estimated at $13 billion peak, largely intact, forcing victims to fight for scraps in a 2021 $4.5 billion deal, later up to $6 billion after Supreme Court pushback in 2024. This hidden maneuvering draws direct lines to Andrew Mellon's tax evasion schemes, where the Pittsburgh banking titan, worth $50 billion in today's dollars from Gulf Oil and Alcoa, dodged the IRS through crafty trusts and deductions in the 1920s and 30s. As Treasury Secretary under 3 presidents, Mellon slashed top tax rates from 73% to 24%, but personally faced fraud charges in 1933 for claiming $3 million in bogus deductions, including gifting art to a trust he controlled, evading $800,000 in taxes, over $15 million today. He funneled wealth into foundations, like the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, still managing $16 billion for heirs, and settled posthumously in 1937 for $668,000 after a grand jury cleared him 11-10, using offshore-like shells to preserve his dynasty. Just as Mellon masked evasion as philanthropy, the Sacklers cloaked transfers as dividends, shielding billions from opioid reckoning. Shifting to royal parallels, the Sacklers' secrecy echoes the Windsor family's sealed wills, a British tradition locking away estates for decades to dodge scandals and taxes. Dating to 1910 with Prince Francis of Teck's will hidden to cover gambling debts, it sealed over 30 royals' documents in a London safe, including Queen Victoria's, in 1901 and Prince Philip's in 2021 for 90 years to protect the Queen's dignity. The High Court grants exemptions under a 1911 convention, keeping details like Philip's $30 million bequest private, avoiding public scrutiny over tax-free inheritance via sovereign grants. Queen Elizabeth II's will, sealed in 2022, hides her $500 million fortune passed to Charles III tax-free under a 1993 exemption for monarch-to-monarch transfers. Critics like The Guardian sued in 2021 over transparency but lost, mirroring how Sacklers use Bermuda trusts exempt from U.S. estate taxes to bury billions, evading lawsuit clause much like Windsor's evade probate prying. Then there's Joseph Bonaparte's smuggling for hidden wealth, the ultimate escape artist after Napoleon's 1815 Waterloo defeat. As ex-king of Spain and Naples, Joseph fled to America with $1 million in diamonds, over $20 million today, sewn into coats or hidden in portraits, arriving in Philadelphia under alias Comte de Servilliers. He bought a 211-acre estate in Bordentown, New Jersey called Point Breeze, smuggling more treasures via ships from Europe, including gold, jewels, and art looted from Spanish palaces, valued at $5 to $10 million then. He buried caches on the property, legends of lost gold persist, and used Swiss banks for funds, living lavishly until 1841 when he returned to Europe richer. U.S. Customs overlooked his hauls due to diplomatic ties, similar to how Sacklers routed billions through Swiss wires without early IRS flags, concealing assets from pursuers like Napoleon's creditors chased Joseph. Framing this as the billions the Sacklers hid offshore captures the epic scale. A $10.7 billion vanishing act from 2008 to 2018, timed as the crisis peaked with 47,600 deaths in 2017, using Bermuda's no-tax trusts and Channel Islands' privacy veils to frustrate EAGs in 24 states, suing for $2 trillion.